Sometimes the cruelest wounds come from those who live under our own roof, and sometimes our greatest victories rise from the ashes of our deepest humiliations. I'm Eleanor, and I've dedicated my life to preserving stories that prove the human spirit can transform even the most devastating betrayals into triumphs of grace and redemption. Just last month, while helping clear out an old seaside cottage in Cape Cod, I discovered something extraordinary tucked inside a flower tin that hadn't been touched in decades, dozens of letters that tell the story of a woman whose own family tried to break her spirit but who found the strength to rebuild her entire life with nothing but kindness and an unwavering belief that love could conquer even the deepest cruelty. This is the true story of Margaret Ellis, a gentle soul who was pushed to the breaking point by those who should have cherished her most, and how she transformed her pain into purpose, her rejection into resilience, and her tears into the foundation for a legacy that would touch hundreds of lives. Have you ever been made to feel worthless by people who were supposed to love you? Have you experienced the kind of humiliation that makes you question your own value? Share your story in the comments, because Margaret's journey will show you that sometimes we must lose everything we thought we needed in order to discover everything we were truly meant to be. The autumn of 1962 had painted the streets of Millfield, Massachusetts in shades of amber and crimson, where Victorian houses stood like gentle giants watching over tree-lined avenues that had sheltered families for generations, and where the scent of wood smoke from countless chimneys mixed with the crisp air to create the kind of atmosphere that made people believe in the possibility of home, comfort, and lasting love within the walls that had witnessed decades of joys and sorrows. Margaret Ellis sat in the faded blue armchair that had been her husband's favorite spot for reading the evening paper, surrounded by the mahogany furniture and lace curtains that she and Harold had chosen together 42 years earlier when they had first moved into the family house on Maple Street, back when their dreams had been full of children's laughter and golden anniversaries and growing old together in the rooms where they had built their life one careful, loving day at a time. At 63 years old, Margaret possessed the kind of beauty that had deepened rather than faded with time. Silver hair that she wore in a soft bun at the nape of her neck, gentle green eyes that still sparkled with warmth despite the sadness that had settled there since Harold's passing 18 months earlier, and hands that bore the gentle calluses of a lifetime spent cooking, cleaning, and caring for everyone she loved with the dedication and selflessness that had defined her character. Since she was a young bride trying to create a perfect home for the family she had hoped to build, Harold's sudden heart attack had left her not only grieving the loss of her life's companion but also struggling to understand how to fill the quiet hours that stretched endlessly through days that had once been structured around his needs, his schedule, and the comfortable rhythms of a marriage that had become as natural and essential as breathing. The house on Maple Street had been Harold's childhood home, inherited from his parents along with the responsibility of maintaining family traditions and the expectation that it would someday pass to the next generation of Ellis children who would continue the legacy of stability and respectability that had been built through hard work, careful saving, and the kind of moral character that had once been the foundation of small-town American life. Margaret and Harold had never been blessed with children of their own, a sorrow that had cast a shadow over their early years of marriage until Harold's younger brother Thomas had died in a car accident, leaving behind a 10-year-old son named David who had come to live with them and had brought the joy of parenthood that they had never expected to experience. David Ellis had grown up in Margaret's care, receiving the kind of patient, nurturing attention that had helped him overcome the trauma of losing his parents while developing the confidence and character that had eventually led to his success as a businessman, his marriage to a young woman named Patricia who had seemed charming and accomplished during their courtship, and his establishment of his own family in a newer part of town where modern conveniences and social status had seemed more important than the traditions and values that had shaped his upbringing in the old family home. Margaret had been genuinely happy about David's marriage and subsequent success, proud of the man he had become and grateful for the grandchildren who had brought new energy and purpose to her life during the years when Harold's health had been declining and her own future had seemed increasingly uncertain. But the dynamics of the Ellis family had begun to change in subtle but troubling ways after Harold's death had eliminated the gentle but firm presence that had always served as a buffer between Margaret's generous nature and Patricia's growing impatience with what she perceived as the inconvenience and obligation of caring for an aging relative whose usefulness had ended with her husband's life and whose continued residence in the family home represented an obstacle to the younger generations. Plans for modernization and progress. Patricia Ellis had never shared her husband's sentimental attachment to the old house or his genuine affection for the woman who had raised him with such devoted care, viewing Margaret instead as a relic of an outdated way of life whose continued presence prevented David from making practical decisions about property and inheritance that would better serve their own family's interests. The Sunday dinners at the Ellis family table had become exercises in endurance for Margaret, who found herself subjected to subtle but persistent criticism about everything from her old-fashioned cooking methods to her failure to keep up with modern decorating trends, her lack of understanding about current social customs, and her general inability to contribute anything meaningful to conversations about topics that Patricia deemed important for people who wanted to be taken seriously in contemporary society. Patricia's comments were always delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a tone that suggested concern rather than cruelty, making it difficult for Margaret to object without seeming overly sensitive or ungrateful for the attention that her daughter-in-law claimed to be showing out of genuine care and family responsibility. The pattern of these meals had become predictably painful for Margaret, who would spend hours preparing elaborate dinners that reflected the traditional recipes and careful presentation that had once been appreciated and praised but which now seemed to invite commentary about calories, modern dietary concerns, and the inefficiency of cooking methods that Patricia had learned about in the women's magazines she read religiously and quoted frequently as authorities on everything from child-rearing to home management to the proper way for women of different ages to dress and behave in polite society. David's participation in these conversations had been limited to uncomfortable silence or weak attempts to change the subject, his obvious discomfort with his wife's treatment of Margaret offset by his apparent inability or unwillingness to confront the woman who had become the dominant voice in his household since their marriage had shifted the balance of power in ways that left Margaret increasingly isolated and uncertain about her place in the family she had helped to create. The breaking point in Margaret's relationship with Patricia had been building for months through a series of incidents that had gradually escalated from passive-aggressive comments to more direct challenges to Margaret's authority in her own home, including suggestions that she should consider moving to a retirement community where she would have appropriate companionship and activities, criticism of her housekeeping standards and personal habits, and increasingly bold assertions that the old family home needed updating and modernization that could only be accomplished if decisions were made by people who understood contemporary standards and expectations. Margaret's attempts to address these concerns through gentle conversations with David had been met with assurances that Patricia meant well and was only trying to help, that adjusting to life after Harold's death was difficult for everyone in the family, and that patience and understanding were needed to help everyone adapt to changes that were inevitable and ultimately beneficial for all concerned. The crisis that would shatter Margaret's life and force her to make the most difficult decision of her widowhood had begun with what should have been a routine family dinner on a cold December evening when snow was beginning to fall outside the dining room windows and the old house was filled with the warmth and light that had always made winter evenings feel cozy and secure despite the harsh weather that threatened beyond the walls that had protected the Ellis family for 3 generations. Margaret had prepared David's favorite meal of pot roast with vegetables and homemade rolls, setting the table with the china that had been her wedding gift from Harold's mother and lighting candles that created the kind of gracious atmosphere that had once been the hallmark of Ellis family gatherings when respect and affection had governed the interactions between family members who understood the importance of tradition and mutual support. Patricia's arrival that evening had been marked by her usual complaints about the weather, the inconvenience of driving to the old part of town, and the general difficulty of maintaining family obligations that required her to leave her own comfortable home to visit a house that she consistently characterized as outdated, impractical, and in need of major renovations that could only be justified if someone were willing to make the kind of substantial investment that would bring the property up to contemporary standards. Her criticism of the dinner had been more pointed than usual, including comments about the outdated presentation, the heavy nature of traditional foods that were inappropriate for modern dietary concerns, and the general inefficiency of cooking methods that wasted both time and energy that could be better spent on activities that contributed to personal growth and social advancement. The conversation during dinner had taken an increasingly personal turn as Patricia had begun to question not just Margaret's cooking and housekeeping but her general usefulness and relevance in a modern family that needed to focus on future opportunities rather than past traditions. Her ability to contribute anything meaningful to discussions about topics that mattered to people who were actively engaged with contemporary culture and society, and her tendency to cling to memories and customs that prevented other family members from moving forward with plans that could benefit everyone if they weren't constrained by sentimental attachments to things that had outlived their practical value. David's failure to defend Margaret against these increasingly harsh criticisms had been particularly painful, as the man she had raised with such devoted care had seemed unable or unwilling to challenge his wife's treatment of the woman who had sacrificed her own desires and opportunities to ensure his happiness and success. The final insult had come when Patricia had begun discussing her ideas for redecorating the dining room in a style that would eliminate the traditional elements that held sentimental value for Margaret while creating a more contemporary atmosphere that would be appropriate for entertaining guests who expected to see evidence of modern taste and financial success rather than outdated furniture and old-fashioned, decorative items that suggested a family that was behind the times and out of touch with current standards of sophisticated living. Patricia's casual dismissal of the family heirlooms and cherished possessions that represented Margaret's entire history and identity had been delivered with the kind of confident authority that suggested these decisions had already been made and that Margaret's preferences and feelings were irrelevant to plans that had been developed by people who understood what needed to be done to bring the Ellis family into the modern era. Margaret's quiet objection to the proposed changes had been met with Patricia's immediate and sharp response that she was being unreasonably sentimental about objects that had no real value and that her resistance to necessary improvements was selfish and unfair to other family members who had to live with the consequences of her inability to accept change and embrace opportunities for progress and modernization. Patricia's voice had risen as she had warmed to her theme, accusing Margaret of being a burden on the family, of using emotional manipulation to prevent others from making practical decisions, and of generally being an obstacle to the happiness and success that David and his children deserved to enjoy without having to worry about the feelings and preferences of someone whose time had passed and whose continued presence in the family home was becoming increasingly problematic for everyone concerned. David's response to his wife's outburst had been to suggest that perhaps the conversation should be continued at another time when everyone had had a chance to calm down and think more clearly about issues that were obviously emotional and complicated. But Patricia's momentum had carried her forward into even more hurtful territory as she had begun to enumerate specific examples of Margaret's supposed shortcomings and failures, her inability to adapt to modern ways of living, her general uselessness in a household that needed to function efficiently without being weighed down by the needs and limitations of someone who belonged in a different era and should accept that her time of usefulness and relevance had ended with her husband's death. The casual cruelty of these statements had been devastating for Margaret, who had never imagined that the young woman she had welcomed into her family and treated with kindness and generosity could harbor such contempt for someone who had never done anything but try to help and support her adjustment to marriage and motherhood. The argument that had followed Patricia's verbal assault had been unlike anything that had ever occurred in the Ellis family home, where respect and courtesy had always governed family interactions even during times of disagreement or stress, and where the values of Christian charity and family loyalty had been assumed to be shared by everyone who sat at the dinner table that Harold had purchased as a symbol of his hopes for generations of happy family gatherings. Patricia's anger had seemed to feed on itself as she had continued her attack on Margaret's character and worth, while David had struggled ineffectively to mediate between his wife and the woman who had raised him, his obvious discomfort with the situation compromised by his apparent fear of confronting his wife directly and his inability to find words that could defend Margaret without seeming to criticize the woman he had married and chosen as the mother of his children. The evening had ended with Patricia's dramatic announcement that she would not continue to subject herself and her children to family gatherings in a house where her opinions and preferences were not respected and where she was expected to pretend that outdated ways of thinking and living were acceptable in a modern family that needed to move forward rather than being held back by someone who refused to accept that times had changed and that new approaches were needed to ensure the family's continued success and social standing. Her threat to end family dinners and limit the children's contact with Margaret had been delivered with the kind of finality that suggested she had been planning this confrontation for some time and that Margaret's objections to the redecorating plans had simply provided the excuse she had been seeking to establish new boundaries that would reduce Margaret's influence and involvement in family decisions. The week that had followed this devastating dinner had been marked by uncomfortable silence from David, who had seemed unable to decide whether to apologize for his wife's behavior or to support her demands for changes that would make future family interactions more pleasant and productive for everyone involved, leaving Margaret in a state of uncertainty about her standing in the family and her future in the home that had been her sanctuary and identity for more than 4 decades. Margaret's attempts to reach out to David through phone calls and brief visits had been met with polite but distant responses that suggested he was struggling with divided loyalties and uncertain about how to repair relationships that had been damaged by conflicts he had not anticipated and did not know how to resolve in ways that would satisfy both his wife and the woman who had been his mother in every way except biology. The crisis that would force Margaret to leave the only home she had known as an adult had occurred on a gray January morning when David had been out of town on business and Patricia had arrived at the house unexpectedly, her purpose quickly revealed as the continuation of the argument that had begun at the December dinner but which had apparently been simmering in her mind during the intervening weeks as she had developed more specific plans for changes that would address what she viewed as the fundamental problems created by Margaret's continued presence in the family home. Patricia's demeanor had been coldly determined rather than emotionally heated, suggesting that her approach had been carefully planned and that she had decided to take advantage of David's absence to have a conversation that might be more difficult to conduct with him present and potentially intervening on Margaret's behalf. Patricia's announcement that she had found a very nice retirement community that would be perfect for someone of Margaret's age and circumstances had been delivered with a kind of false cheerfulness that made it clear this was not a suggestion but a decision that had already been made and which Margaret was expected to accept gracefully as the best solution for everyone involved in a situation that had become uncomfortable and unsustainable for reasons that were entirely Margaret's fault and responsibility. Patricia's description of the retirement community had emphasized the social opportunities, organized activities, and peer companionship that would be much more appropriate for Margaret than the isolation and irrelevance she was experiencing in a family home where her presence was no longer needed or particularly welcome. Margaret's shocked response that she had no intention of leaving the home she had shared with Harold and where she intended to live for the remainder of her life had been met with Patricia's patient explanation that this decision was not really Margaret's to make, since the practical and financial aspects of maintaining the house required input from family members who would be responsible for expenses and arrangements that were beyond Margaret's ability to manage independently. Patricia's suggestion that Margaret was being unrealistic about her capabilities and resources had been accompanied by detailed arguments about the costs of heating and maintaining an old house, the difficulties of grocery shopping and housekeeping for someone of Margaret's age, and the general impracticality of allowing an elderly widow to live alone in a large house that could better serve the needs of a growing family with children who needed space and modern conveniences. The confrontation had escalated when Margaret had firmly refused to consider leaving her home and had asked Patricia to respect her decision and to stop pressuring her about arrangements that were none of Patricia's business and which Margaret was perfectly capable of managing with the resources and support systems she had already established during the 18 months since Harold's death. Patricia's response had been to question Margaret's mental competence and emotional stability, suggesting that grief and age had affected her judgment in ways that made it inappropriate for her to make important decisions without guidance from family members who could see the situation more clearly and objectively than someone who was too emotionally involved to recognize what was best for everyone concerned. The argument had reached its climax when Patricia had demanded the keys to the house, claiming that David had asked her to take possession of them as part of arrangements that were being made for Margaret's transfer to the retirement community, an obvious lie that had been intended to trick Margaret into surrendering control of her own property and which had revealed the extent to which Patricia was willing to use deception and manipulation to achieve her goals of removing Margaret from the family home and gaining control of property that had never belonged to her and which she had no legal right to claim or control. Margaret's refusal to hand over the keys had prompted Patricia's final threat that if Margaret would not leave voluntarily, she would be forced to leave involuntarily, a statement that had been accompanied by Patricia's physical attempt to search Margaret's purse for keys that she claimed belonged to David rather than to the woman who had been living in the house since before Patricia was born. The struggle over Margaret's purse had been brief but humiliating, ending when Patricia had managed to grab not only the house keys but also Margaret's wallet and personal belongings, which she had claimed would be returned when Margaret agreed to be reasonable about arrangements that were being made for her own good and the benefit of the entire family. Patricia's announcement that Margaret could stay in her room until David returned from his business trip but that she would not be allowed to use the common areas of the house or to invite visitors without permission had been accompanied by her threat to call the police if Margaret attempted to retrieve her keys or to interfere with decisions that had been made by family members who had legal authority to make such decisions on behalf of someone whose mental condition made her incapable of managing her own affairs. The final blow had come when Patricia had locked Margaret out of the kitchen and dining room, claiming that these areas needed to be cleaned and organized by people who understood proper standards of hygiene and efficiency, leaving Margaret with access only to her bedroom and the small adjoining bathroom while Patricia had proceeded to go through the house systematically, removing items that she claimed were valuable or important and packing them in boxes that she said would be stored safely until decisions could be made about their proper disposition. Margaret's protests about the theft of her personal belongings had been dismissed as the emotional outbursts of someone who was obviously unable to think clearly about practical matters that required rational decision-making by people who were not overwhelmed by sentiment and nostalgia. The 3 days that Margaret had spent locked in her own bedroom while Patricia had taken control of the house had been among the most humiliating and frightening of her entire life, as she had been forced to depend on her captor for food and water while listening to the sounds of her home being systematically dismantled and reorganized according to the preferences of someone who had no legal right to be making such changes but who had temporarily gained control through manipulation, deception, and the exploitation of David's absence during a critical period when his intervention might have prevented the situation from escalating to such extremes. Margaret's attempts to contact David by telephone had been thwarted by Patricia's removal of the phone from her bedroom and her surveillance of Margaret's movements whenever she was allowed brief access to the bathroom or given permission to receive small amounts of food and water. The breaking point had come on the morning of the fourth day when Patricia had announced that the retirement community was ready to receive Margaret immediately and that transportation had been arranged to take her there along with a small suitcase containing items that Patricia had selected as appropriate for her new living situation, while everything else would remain in the house to be properly organized and distributed among family members who could make better use of objects that Margaret had obviously been unable to maintain or appreciate properly. Margaret's realization that Patricia was serious about forcing her removal from her own home had been accompanied by the understanding that David's return might not occur in time to prevent actions that could not be undone and which would leave her permanently separated from everything that represented her identity and her connection to the life she had built with Harold. Margaret's decision to leave the house voluntarily rather than submit to forcible removal had been motivated not by acceptance of Patricia's authority or agreement with her decisions, but by the recognition that remaining would only lead to further humiliation and that preserving her dignity required her to make her own choice about when and how to leave the home that had been stolen from her through manipulation and abuse of trust rather than through any legal right or moral authority that Patricia actually possessed. Margaret's packing of a single small suitcase with essential clothing and personal items had been done quickly and quietly while Patricia was occupied with making phone calls to arrange transportation, Margaret's goal being to leave before Patricia could claim credit for successfully forcing her departure or impose additional humiliations as part of the process of removing someone she had characterized as a burden and obstacle to family progress. The walk down Maple Street on that cold January morning had been the most difficult of Margaret's life, as she had turned her back on the house that had been her sanctuary and identity for 42 years while carrying everything that remained of her independence and security in a small suitcase that represented the complete destruction of a life that had been built through decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion to family members who had ultimately chosen convenience over loyalty and progress over tradition. The snow that had begun to fall as Margaret had walked away from her former home had seemed appropriate to the death of hopes and dreams that had sustained her through the challenges of aging and widowhood, while the cold wind had matched the chill that had settled around her heart as she had faced the reality of starting over at an age when most people were settled in comfortable routines supported by family relationships that provided security and purpose. The bus ride that had taken Margaret away from Millfield and toward an uncertain future had been marked by a mixture of grief for what she had lost and determination to find a way to rebuild her life without depending on people who had proven themselves unworthy of the trust and affection she had given them so generously and for so many years. Margaret's destination had been the small coastal town of Seabrook, where she remembered visiting years earlier with Harold and where she had once helped a young widow named Rose Campbell through a difficult period following her husband's death in a fishing accident that had left her struggling to support herself and her children through the operation of a small bakery that had been more charitable enterprise than profitable business. Margaret's memories of Rose Campbell had been vague but warm, recalling a woman whose courage in the face of tragedy had been inspiring and whose gratitude for small acts of kindness had made Margaret feel useful and appreciated in ways that had contrasted sharply with the treatment she had recently received from her own family members. The hope that Rose might remember her kindness and be willing to offer temporary shelter while Margaret determined her next steps had been the only plan Margaret had been able to develop during the bus ride that had taken her further from everything familiar and comfortable with each passing mile, leaving her completely dependent on the charity of someone who might not even remember their brief interaction from years earlier. The Seabrook of 1963 was a working fishing village where weathered houses clung to rocky cliffs overlooking an Atlantic Ocean that provided both livelihood and danger to families whose men earned their living from waters that could be generous or cruel depending on weather, season, and the mysterious forces that governed the migration of fish and the mood of storms that could appear without warning and destroy lives that had been built through generations of courage and hardship. The salty air and the constant sound of waves breaking against granite rocks had created an atmosphere that was both harsh and beautiful, where survival required cooperation and mutual support among neighbors who understood that individual prosperity depended on community strength and that helping others in times of need was not just charity but practical investment in relationships that might someday mean the difference between survival and disaster. Rose Campbell's bakery had been located in a small building near the harbor where fishing boats returned each evening with catches that determined whether families would eat well or struggle through another week of uncertainty about their economic future, and where the warmth of ovens and the comfort of fresh bread had provided refuge for people whose lives were governed by the harsh realities of making a living from an ocean that demanded respect and offered no guarantees about tomorrow's opportunities or challenges. The bakery had served not only as a business that provided Rose with modest income but also as a community gathering place where fishermen's wives had exchanged news and offered each other support during times when their husbands were at sea and their own resources were stretched thin by the demands of raising children and maintaining households on uncertain incomes. Margaret's arrival at Rose Campbell's bakery on that snowy January afternoon had been tentative and uncertain, as she had knocked on the door without knowing whether Rose would remember her or be willing to offer assistance to someone whose desperation was obvious despite her attempts to maintain dignity and composure in circumstances that had stripped away most of her security and confidence. The woman who had answered Margaret's knock had aged during the years since their last meeting but had retained the kind eyes and gentle manner that had made her memorable despite the brief nature of their previous interaction, and her immediate recognition of Margaret's identity and distress had been followed by the kind of warm welcome that had made Margaret understand that she had found not just temporary shelter but genuine friendship with someone who understood the value of kindness. Without calculation or judgment. Rose's invitation for Margaret to stay as long as she needed while figuring out her next steps had been offered without questions about the circumstances that had brought her to Seabrook with nothing but a suitcase and obvious heartbreak, reflecting the wisdom of someone who had learned through her own experiences with loss and struggle that people in crisis needed acceptance and support rather than curiosity about details that might be too painful to share immediately. The small apartment above the bakery that Rose had offered to Margaret had been simple and clean, furnished with the basic necessities that would allow her to maintain privacy and independence while being close enough to offer help with the bakery operations if she chose to contribute to the enterprise that provided Rose with both livelihood and purpose. The first weeks of Margaret's residence in Seabrook had been marked by a combination of grief for what she had lost and wonder at the discovery of a community where mutual support was assumed rather than grudging, where neighbors looked out for each other without being asked, and where Margaret's skills and experience were appreciated rather than dismissed as outdated or irrelevant by people who understood the value of traditional knowledge and craftsmanship in a world that was changing so rapidly that wisdom sometimes seemed less important than novelty. Margaret's gradual involvement in the bakery's operations had begun with simple tasks that had helped Rose during busy periods, but had evolved into a partnership that had drawn on Margaret's decades of experience with cooking and baking while providing her with purpose and income that had restored her sense of usefulness and self-worth. The discovery that Margaret possessed exceptional skills in bread making and pastry preparation had been made gradually as Rose had observed her guests' natural competence with dough, her intuitive understanding of temperature and timing, and her ability to create baked goods that surpassed anything that Rose had been able to produce despite her own years of experience and dedication to maintaining quality standards that had kept the bakery viable despite economic challenges that had forced other small businesses in Seabrook to close or reduce their services. Margaret's contributions to the bakery had been motivated initially by gratitude for Rose's generosity and her desire to earn her keep rather than accept charity, but had developed into genuine joy in work that utilized her talents while serving people who appreciated the results of her efforts. The reputation of Rose Campbell's Bakery had begun to expand beyond Seabrook's local community as word had spread about the exceptional quality of baked goods that were being produced by the addition of a new baker whose skills had elevated the establishment from a neighborhood convenience to a destination that attracted customers from neighboring towns who made special trips to purchase items that could not be found elsewhere in the region. Margaret's specialty breads and pastries had become legendary among people who appreciated craftsmanship and traditional methods that produced results superior to the mass-produced alternatives that were becoming increasingly common in commercial establishments that prioritized efficiency and profit over quality and customer satisfaction. The success of the bakery had provided both Margaret and Rose with financial security that had exceeded their modest expectations while also creating a sense of accomplishment and pride that had been therapeutic for Margaret as she had recovered from the emotional trauma of being rejected by her own family and forced to start over in circumstances that could have been devastating for someone with less resilience and determination to create meaning from hardship. Margaret's letters to David during this period had been brief and factual, informing him of her location and general well-being without providing details about her new life that might have been interpreted as attempts to make him feel guilty about his failure to protect her from his wife's cruelty or to solicit sympathy for circumstances that she was managing successfully without assistance from family members who had proven themselves unworthy of her trust. David's eventual decision to visit Margaret in Seabrook had been prompted not by concern for her welfare or desire to make amends for his failure to defend her against Patricia's abuse, but by business problems that had made him desperate for financial assistance that he hoped Margaret might be willing to provide based on their previous relationship and her apparent prosperity in her new circumstances. David's assumption that Margaret would be living in reduced circumstances and would be grateful for any attention from family members who had previously rejected her had been based on his inability to imagine that she could have created a successful and satisfying life without depending on the Ellis family resources and connections that he believed were essential for security and respectability in modern American society. Margaret's reaction to David's unexpected visit had been complex, as she had felt genuine happiness at seeing the young man she had raised with such devoted care while also experiencing sadness about the circumstances that had brought him to seek her help only when his own resources had proved inadequate to solve problems that had been created by his own poor judgment and his wife's expensive tastes and unrealistic expectations about lifestyle and social status. David's obvious surprise at discovering Margaret's prosperity and contentment in her new life had been accompanied by his difficulty in understanding how she had managed to create success and happiness without the family support system that he had assumed was necessary for someone of her age and limited resources. Margaret's response to David's request for financial assistance had been gentle but firm, as she had explained that her resources were committed to the bakery business and to her partnership with Rose, and that she could not provide the kind of substantial help he was seeking without jeopardizing the security and independence she had worked so hard to establish in the wake of her forced departure from the family home. Margaret's suggestion that David's financial problems might be solved through more careful management of expenses and more realistic expectations about lifestyle had been offered with the kind of loving concern that had characterized her relationship with him throughout his childhood, but had been received with disappointment and frustration that reflected his inability to accept responsibility for decisions that had created his current difficulties. The conversation between Margaret and David had revealed the extent to which their relationship had been damaged by his failure to defend her against Patricia's cruelty and his acquiescence in arrangements that had resulted in her exile from the family home and separation from possessions and memories that had represented her entire life's accumulation of happiness and security. David's attempts to apologize for Patricia's behavior had been undermined by his continued loyalty to his wife and his apparent expectation that Margaret should be willing to overlook past injuries in favor of maintaining family relationships that would provide him with access to resources he needed to solve his current problems without having to face consequences for his own poor choices and weak character. Margaret's forgiveness of David's failures had been genuine and complete, but her refusal to enable his continued dependence on others to solve problems he had created had been based on her understanding that true love sometimes required allowing people to face consequences that could teach them lessons about responsibility and self-reliance that could not be learned through continued rescue from difficulties that were the natural results of poor judgment and unrealistic expectations. Margaret's decision to maintain her new life in Seabrook rather than returning to Millfield to resume family relationships that had been proven harmful and destructive had been presented to David as a choice that reflected her own needs and preferences rather than punishment for his past failures or rejection of his future welfare. The years that had followed David's visit had been marked by Margaret's continued growth and success in her partnership with Rose, as their bakery had become one of the most respected establishments in the region while also serving as a model for other small businesses that had sought to combine traditional quality with modern business practices that could ensure sustainability and profitability in an increasingly competitive marketplace. Margaret's reputation as a baker had attracted attention from food writers and culinary enthusiasts who had written articles about the exceptional breads and pastries that were being produced in a small coastal town by a woman whose dedication to traditional methods and natural ingredients had created products that were superior to anything available from commercial producers. The recognition that Margaret had received for her baking skills had been accompanied by opportunities to teach and share her knowledge with younger bakers who had been eager to learn traditional techniques that were in danger of being lost as automation and mass production had become the dominant approaches to commercial food preparation. Margaret's informal teaching activities had evolved into structured workshops and apprenticeships that had attracted students from throughout New England who had been willing to travel to Seabrook to learn from someone whose skills had been refined through decades of practice and whose commitment to quality had been proven through the success of her partnership with Rose. The community leadership role that Margaret had gradually assumed in Seabrook had been based not on formal positions or elected offices but on her demonstrated competence, reliability, and commitment to helping others solve problems and overcome challenges that might otherwise have prevented individuals and families from achieving stability and prosperity in a town where economic opportunities were limited and where success required cooperation and mutual support among neighbors who understood that individual welfare depended on community strength. Margaret's involvement in organizing community events, supporting local charities, and mentoring young people had reflected her understanding that her own success created obligations to contribute to the welfare of others who might benefit from her knowledge, resources, and experience. Margaret's transformation from a woman who had been dismissed as useless and irrelevant by her own family into someone who was respected and valued by an entire community had been accomplished through her demonstration of the principles that had always guided her life but which had been underappreciated by people who had confused material success with personal worth and who had failed to recognize the value of qualities like kindness, generosity, and loyalty that could not be measured in terms of social status or financial achievement. The contrast between her treatment in Millfield and her acceptance in Seabrook had provided Margaret with clear evidence about the importance of choosing to associate with people who shared her values rather than trying to earn approval from those who judged others based on superficial criteria that had little connection to genuine character or moral worth. The decision to officially establish Grace and Hearth Bakery as a permanent institution had been made jointly by Margaret and Rose as their partnership had evolved into a friendship that had enriched both of their lives while creating an enterprise that had served not only their own needs for income and purpose but also the broader community's needs for gathering place, economic activity, and symbol of the possibility that individual initiative and cooperation could create prosperity and happiness even in circumstances that might initially seem challenging or unpromising. The name they had chosen for their bakery had reflected both Margaret's understanding of the role that divine providence had played in bringing her to Seabrook and their shared commitment to creating a place where people could find both physical nourishment and spiritual comfort through the simple act of sharing food that had been prepared with care and offered with love. Sometimes our most painful rejections lead us to our most beautiful destinations. Margaret thought her family had destroyed her when they pushed her away, but they actually freed her to discover a life more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined in that cold house on Maple Street. Her story shows us that when people treat us as expendable, they're actually revealing their own emptiness, not our worth. The community that welcomed Margaret with open arms recognized something her own family had been too blind to see, that kindness creates its own kind of wealth, and that a heart dedicated to service will always find a home where it's truly appreciated. If you've ever felt discarded by people who should have cherished you, or if you've found unexpected family in places you never expected to belong, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. These experiences of discovering our true worth through the eyes of those who see us clearly remind us that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are actually doing us the greatest favor by pushing us toward the love we were always meant to find. The letter that had arrived from Patricia several years after Margaret's departure from Millfield had been unexpected and had created complex emotions as Margaret had read words that seemed to represent genuine remorse and a desire to make amends for behavior that Patricia now claimed to recognize as cruel and unjustified by any reasonable standards of family loyalty or Christian charity. The letter had described Patricia's own struggles with loneliness and regret following David's decision to leave their marriage after discovering the extent of her manipulation and deception regarding Margaret's departure, and her growing understanding that her treatment of Margaret had been motivated by jealousy and insecurity rather than legitimate concerns about practical arrangements or family welfare. Patricia's request to visit Margaret in Seabrook had been accompanied by expressions of shame about her past behavior and hope that Margaret might be willing to consider forgiveness that could begin the process of healing relationships that had been damaged by actions that Patricia now understood had been driven by her own character flaws rather than any failures on Margaret's part to adapt to changing family circumstances or contribute meaningfully to household management and family life. The vulnerability and apparent sincerity of Patricia's letter had created a dilemma for Margaret, who had achieved peace and happiness in her new life but who also retained enough Christian charity to consider whether offering forgiveness might serve Patricia's spiritual needs while also demonstrating the values of compassion and redemption that had always been central to Margaret's understanding of how people should treat each other. Margaret's decision to invite Patricia for a visit had been motivated not by any desire to restore their previous relationship or to return to family dynamics that had proven harmful, but by her recognition that forgiveness was as much for the forgiver as for the person being forgiven, and that her own spiritual growth required her to extend the kind of grace that she had received from others during her own times of need and crisis. Margaret's preparation for Patricia's visit had included conversations with Rose about the wisdom of opening old wounds and the possibility that Patricia's apparent remorse might not be sincere or lasting, but had ultimately been guided by Margaret's belief that taking reasonable risks in service of compassion was preferable to allowing fear or resentment to prevent actions that might create positive change. Patricia's arrival in Seabrook had revealed a woman who appeared genuinely humbled by the consequences of her past actions and who seemed to have gained some understanding of the pain she had caused through her treatment of someone who had never done anything to deserve such cruelty and rejection. Patricia's obvious surprise at discovering Margaret's prosperity and contentment had been accompanied by expressions of regret that were more convincing than Margaret had expected, suggesting that Patricia's letter had accurately reflected her emotional state rather than representing another attempt at manipulation designed to achieve some hidden agenda that would ultimately benefit Patricia at Margaret's expense. The conversation between Margaret and Patricia during that visit had been difficult but ultimately healing for both women, as Patricia had been able to express her remorse in person while Margaret had been able to demonstrate the kind of gracious forgiveness that had been possible only because she had found security and happiness that were independent of Patricia's approval or acceptance. Margaret's gift of fresh bread to Patricia at the end of the visit had been accompanied by her gentle suggestion that it was never too late to learn warmth, a statement that had reflected Margaret's belief in the possibility of redemption and change while also making it clear that she had moved beyond resentment into a state of genuine compassion for someone who had suffered consequences for her own poor choices. The ongoing correspondence that had developed between Margaret and Patricia following that visit had been limited but cordial, marked by Patricia's occasional updates about her efforts to rebuild her life and make amends for past mistakes, and Margaret's brief but encouraging responses that had offered support without creating expectations or obligations that might have been difficult for either woman to maintain over time. The relationship that had emerged from their reconciliation had been very different from any family connection they had previously shared, based on mutual respect and understanding rather than the artificial roles and expectations that had created conflict when Patricia had tried to assert authority over someone whose wisdom and experience had been superior to her own. Margaret's later years in Seabrook had been marked by continued growth in her reputation and influence as both a baker and a community leader, as her example of overcoming rejection and creating meaning from hardship had inspired other people who had faced their own challenges with aging, family conflict, and economic uncertainty. The workshops and mentoring programs that Margaret had developed had created a legacy that had extended her influence beyond her immediate community to benefit people throughout the region who had learned from her not only practical skills related to baking and food preparation but also life lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of surrounding oneself with people who recognized and appreciated individual worth rather than judging others based on superficial criteria or temporary circumstances. The success of Grace and Hearth Bakery had created opportunities for Margaret to expand her charitable activities and community service, as the financial security that had resulted from her partnership with Rose had provided resources that could be shared with others who were facing difficulties similar to those Margaret had experienced during her own period of crisis and transition. Margaret's quiet generosity had helped numerous individuals and families overcome temporary setbacks and achieve stability that might not have been possible without assistance from someone who understood the importance of maintaining dignity while accepting help that was offered with genuine care and respect rather than condescension or judgment. The recognition that Margaret had received from culinary organizations and business associations had been gratifying but had been less important to her than the knowledge that her work had contributed to the welfare and happiness of people in her adopted community who had welcomed her when she had needed a place to rebuild her life and who had continued to value her contributions even as she had aged and faced the inevitable physical limitations that had required her to gradually reduce her direct involvement in the bakery's daily operations. Margaret's transition from active baker to advisor and mentor had been managed gracefully, with Rose and younger staff members taking over responsibilities that Margaret could no longer handle while continuing to benefit from her knowledge and experience. The final years of Margaret's life had been spent in the comfort of knowing that she had successfully transformed rejection and humiliation into a legacy of service and accomplishment that had enriched not only her own life but the lives of countless other people who had been touched by her example of grace under pressure and her demonstration that individual worth was not determined by other people's opinions but by one's own choices about how to respond to challenges and opportunities that life presented. Margaret's peaceful death in her apartment above the bakery had been mourned by the entire Seabrook community, whose members had understood that they had lost not just a skilled baker but a moral leader whose life had illustrated the power of kindness to create positive change in circumstances that might initially seem hopeless or insurmountable. The memorial service that had been held for Margaret had been attended by people from throughout the region who had been influenced by her teaching, inspired by her example, or simply touched by her kindness during encounters that might have seemed minor to her but which had created lasting positive memories for recipients of her generosity and compassion. The stories that had been shared about Margaret's impact on individual lives had created a collective portrait of someone whose rejection by her own family had ultimately led to her discovery of a broader family that had been created through shared values rather than biological relationships, and whose influence had extended far beyond what anyone could have predicted when she had arrived in Seabrook with nothing but a suitcase and broken heart. The continuation of Grace and Hearth Bakery under Rose's leadership had ensured that Margaret's legacy would remain visible and active in serving the Seabrook community, while the scholarship fund that had been established in her memory had provided opportunities for young people to learn traditional baking skills while also receiving education about the values of service, perseverance, and kindness that had made Margaret's life meaningful despite the challenges and setbacks she had faced. The annual Margaret Ellis Day that had been established by the Seabrook Town Council had created an opportunity for community members to remember her contributions while also celebrating the principles she had embodied throughout her residence in their town. The letters and recipes that Margaret had left behind had been preserved as historical documents that provided future generations with both practical knowledge about traditional baking techniques and spiritual insight about the importance of maintaining faith and compassion even in the face of rejection and hardship that might have justified bitterness or resentment in someone with less strength of character and commitment to Christian values. Margaret's written reflections about her experiences had revealed someone who had understood that her exile from Millfield had ultimately been a blessing that had allowed her to discover capabilities and create relationships that would not have been possible if she had remained in circumstances that had stifled her potential and undervalued her contributions. The transformation of Margaret's story from personal tragedy to community inspiration had demonstrated the power of individual choice to create meaning from circumstances that might have seemed purely destructive, while also illustrating the importance of communities that were willing to recognize and nurture talents and virtues that might be overlooked or underappreciated by people who were too focused on superficial measures of success to recognize genuine worth when it appeared in unexpected forms or circumstances. Margaret's legacy had become part of Seabrook's identity as a place where people were judged by their contributions rather than their backgrounds, and where second chances were available to those who were willing to work hard and treat others with respect and kindness. The broader impact of Margaret's story had extended beyond Seabrook to influence discussions about aging, family relationships, and community responsibility in an era when traditional extended family structures were being challenged by mobility, changing social values, and economic pressures that sometimes created conflicts between individual desires and family obligations that had once been assumed to be permanent and unquestionable. Margaret's experience had provided an example of how individual resilience could overcome family failure while also illustrating the importance of communities that were willing to provide support and opportunities to people who might not have traditional family resources but who possessed valuable skills and positive character traits that could contribute to collective welfare and prosperity. As I hold these precious letters that chronicle Margaret's journey from rejection to redemption, I'm overwhelmed by the profound truth they reveal about the nature of real family and genuine success. Margaret's own blood relations saw her as a burden to be discarded, but the community of Seabrook recognized her as a treasure to be cherished. Her story teaches us that sometimes the people who reject us are actually setting us free to find where we truly belong, and that our greatest defeats can become the foundation for our most beautiful victories when we respond to cruelty with kindness and to rejection with grace. What moves me most about Margaret's story is how she never allowed bitterness to poison the wellspring of love in her heart. Even when Patricia came to her years later, trembling with shame and seeking forgiveness, Margaret responded not with the anger that would have been justified, but with the compassion that made her truly great. She handed Patricia bread not as a gesture of superiority, but as an offering of hope. She said it was never too late to learn warmth again, and in doing so, she proved that the warmest hearts are often found in those who have endured the coldest treatment. Margaret's legacy at Grace and Hearth Bakery reminds us that when we build something with love and integrity, it outlasts the temporary pain of being misunderstood or mistreated. The community that embraced her didn't just gain a skilled baker, they gained a teacher, a healer, and a living example of how grace can transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Have you ever been made to feel worthless by people who should have valued you? Have you found unexpected family in places you never thought to look? Maybe you've experienced the pain of being rejected by those closest to you, or perhaps you've been blessed to be someone's chosen family when their biological family failed them. Your stories matter, and sharing them in the comments helps all of us understand that we're not alone in facing these challenges. If you have ideas for other stories about people who found their true worth after being discarded by others, please share those suggestions too. If Margaret's story has shown you that your value isn't determined by how others treat you but by the love you choose to share with the world, please subscribe to hear more tales of people who transformed their deepest wounds into their greatest strengths. Your support helps me continue preserving these stories that prove kindness is never wasted, grace always wins, and love has the power to rebuild what cruelty tries to destroy. I'm Eleanor, and I rescue these stories because they remind us that our worth is not determined by who claims us, but by how we claim ourselves and others. Margaret Ellis proved that when we build our lives on foundations of service and compassion, we create legacies that no amount of family rejection can ever diminish. Her story shows us that sometimes the people who push us away are actually pushing us toward the love we were always meant to find.